Throughout history there have been a number of terrifying and tragic torture methods which aim to inflict suffering, pain and even death onto a prisoner. There was the oubliette, a tiny dungeon inside of many medieval castles where prisoners were forced to be locked into one position 24 hours a day, driving them mad. The oubliette's purpose was to simply forget and leave someone to rot and succumb to their ordeal, and these dungeons were only ever a one-way ticket to death. There were other methods which were aimed to humiliate, for example the scold's bridle, which was a head device which was applied to women, who were considered gossips and scolds. This sometimes locked the victim's tongue in place so they could not speak, but the main aim of this device was to bring shame onto someone. But there was another torture method used in history which aimed to attract shame and hate. Join us today as we look at tarring and feathering, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Tarring and feathering was a form of punishment used to enact revenge. The victim was sometimes stripped or stripped to the waist, then tar, which was sometimes hot, was thrown and poured onto the person while they were held down. Following this tar being applied, the victim then had feathers thrown on them, or they were rolled in feathers, so that these stuck to the tar. This punishment method is older than it's believed, as the earliest mention of it occurred in Richard I's England, as he issued an order to his navy that, concerning the laws and ordinances appointed by King Richard for his navy, the former thereof was this, item a thief or felon, that hath stolen, being lawfully convicted, shall have his head shorn, and boiling pitch poured upon his head, and feathers or down strawn upon the same whereby he may know, and so at the first landing place they shall come by, there to be cast up. In many different countries this was used, and in Spain in 1623 it was said that the boisterous Bishop of Halberstadt, a German Protestant military leader, having taken a place where there were 2 monasteries of nuns and friars, he caused divers feathers beds to be ripped, and the feathers thrown into a great hall, whither the nuns and friars were thrust naked with their bodies oiled and pitched, and to tumble amongst those feathers, which makes them, here Madrid, presage him an ill death. In the same century in London, a bailiff tried to get money back from someone who owed money, and this man had then taken shelter in the Savoy. But the bailiff was then tarred and feathered, and he was then taken in a wheelbarrow to the Strand, and he was then tied to a maypole that stood outside of Somerset House in a pillory to add shame to the bailiff. But this punishment was used heavily inside of the Americas, and it became popular during the 1700s. It was used as a way of protesting, and there were a number of featherings to protest against the Tea Act. Archibald McCall, a landowner, was targeted by a mob in Virginia as he collected the British tax that people owed. A mob stormed his house and threw rocks through the windows, and then when he was captured he was tarred and feathered. Another man in Virginia was also tarred and feathered, and following his ordeal in 1766 he was thrown into the harbour by an angry mob. A boat then got him out of the water when he was close to drowning, and he later said, "They daubed my face and body all over with tar, and afterwards threw feathers on me." But the practice spread across states as a number of attacks occurred, and some were more violent than others. In Boston in January 1774, a customs commissioner was whipped and beaten along with his ordeal, and he was also forced to drink tea until he was sick. Other protesters threw excrement and waste at the victim also, and some had this smeared in their eyes, and one man in 1775 in Connecticut was forced to eat hog's dung for expressing a pro-British sentiment. But then in 1775, a violent tarring took place, as Thomas Brown was stripped and tied to a tree, and following this hot pitch was poured over him, and he was then set on fire. This resulted in some of his toes being charred, and he was then feathered and scalped by the Sons of Liberty. The practice in America continued as people protested, but there was no known case of someone dying in America during the 18th century from the ordeal. But the torture method continued, and the priests were targeted in America, including Joseph Smith, the founder of the Latter-day Saints. But tarring and feathering was also applied to women. 4 young married women were accused of evil conduct by their neighbour, and these were then feathered in front of 200 workmen. But there were examples of the torture being used during World War I, as anti-German feelings and sentiments spread across the states. Because of this, Americans with German heritage were attacked and were tarred and feathered. But even during the Troubles in Ireland, some women were subjected to this, as they were accused of having relationships with British soldiers or policemen. Tarring and feathering was a brutal torture method which was aimed to shame and punish people in public. It was aimed to make people hurl abuse and hurt upon an individual, and it must have been a damaging ordeal for someone to experience. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.